Hey, welcome back to the realm of history there, ballers. Yeah, we got chapter 2 on the horizon tomorrow. Just want to make sure that I'm here to help you out. But yeah, we got a mystery out there. Who is this Billy character? We got to figure that one out. I need some help on that one. Hey, if you're enjoying these review sessions, if you're getting some out of it, go ahead and like this video. Give me a shout out in the comments. Let me know who's here, who's paying attention, who's ready for the quiz tomorrow. A little bit of the agenda for today, of course. We're going to have some key advice right off at the start. Most of my key advice is always the same. Just want to remind you of the key things you need to know. We'll go through most of the key terms, some of the selected key figures and places. I will be giving you some pointers on the short answer. We're going to have a special section today on some of my AP advice and preparation from the AMSCO reading. Then we'll have question and answer session, and then some time for some final pieces of advice. So let's get right into it with the key advice right off the bat. Number one, hey, as always, make sure that you're writing things down from this session. I think you could write it on the back side of your review sheet or something along those lines to help you make sure that you are ready and on point for tomorrow. Number two, pray for the right things, right? Make sure that we're not praying for success on this quiz. Remember that we got to put things into perspective. We got to make sure that we're praying the prayer of gratitude, saying thank you to the good Lord for all the great blessings that he has bestowed upon us. Number three, I think it's more important than ever now that things start piling up for you and you have quizzes in your other classes and things of that nature, that you really focus on being here now, making sure that you are focused on the task at hand. When you enter into the realm, you pop in history and you focus on that. Tonight, before you go to bed, whatever you're studying, hopefully it's this. If it's not this, if it's something else, focus on that. And when you're in your other classes, make sure that you are focused on those classes as well. Number four, a big one. Make sure, once again, you say thank you to your parents. They do a lot for you. Okay, whoever's taking care of you is doing a great job. You're all great students. You're great young people. And I really appreciate you. But you got to give some homage to your parents. They are really the basic necessity of why you are so successful and all the blessings that you have. You really need to say thank you to them and give them a hug before you go to bed tonight. Or you could do it right now if you really want to. Number five, as I said, the quizzes are going to get more and more challenging. I think the content part tomorrow, there'll be a couple of nuances there that may challenge you, but I think that AMSCO, the AP part, is going to be the big challenge that we need to rise to the occasion on for tomorrow. Okay, I'm not going to check the comments just yet, but hey, as you're going through the comments, keep it classy, keep it clean, keep it professional, and of course, rep the realm in everything that you do. But let's go ahead and get into some of the key terms, the key places, and the key figures. You're going to be able to see those on your screen. So I'm going to try to go a little slower this time as we don't have as many key terms to go through. But I think, it's important to pay attention and make sure that you are either writing these things down or capturing the key ideas as best as you can. Okay, let's talk first about a city-state. A city-state is a political unit, and it operates kind of like an independent kingdom, but it does share similar cultural traits with surrounding lands. You could also look at it as a city and its surrounding land that operates as an independent political unit. So kind of the combination of those two things would be the best way that I would say you want to be able to answer questions regarding a city-state. Now, remember, you might not get smacked in the face with this exact definition. You may have to utilize your understanding of this definition to answer a question like a multiple choice. So make sure that you're not just so focused on rote memorization, but rather understanding and being able to apply the key concepts. Okay, next is cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion is a really big picture term for our class. It's going to be one that we're going to be using throughout the remainder of the year. And so it's really a process. It's a process by which ideas, inventions, and even beliefs, like religious beliefs, are spread from one culture or group to another. In the AMSCO reading, it talks about the Silk Roads and Indian Ocean trade and how that spread Buddhism and Islam and other forms of faith practitioners. So I think that it's important to understand that cultural diffusion is really a big term. It really meant the cultural spread of a lot of different ideas, inventions, and of course, belief and faith systems. Next up is cuneiform. We've had cuneiform in both chapters. It's the world's first writing system. It was developed by the Sumerians. One thing I would add is that early cuneiform was written into stone and clay tablets. That's really clay tablets are some of the first forms that we find cuneiform still remaining today. Next is a pretty simple term. We talked about this in class quite often. It's called a dynasty. A dynasty is a series of rulers from the same family, right? We had some different examples with students in class, but we have a king, and the reign or the throne or the realm is going to be passed down to that king's son. Usually it's as the AMSCO book mentioned, a patriarchal lineage. Sometimes a matriarchal lineage, but usually throughout history, a patriarchal lineage means it's passed down from the male to the male, father to son, son to grandson, so on and so forth. Sort of similar, but a distant term is empire. An empire is where you unite several peoples, groups, or actually formerly independent states under the control of a single ruler. One of the big examples that I can share with you from this chapter is Sargon of Akkad, right? Sargon of Akkad actually forms the world's first documented empire by conquering both North and South Sumer. He conquers not only one city-state, but 5 or 6, taking them all under his control, which creates a great example of an empire. All right, irrigation is next. A lot of questions about irrigation today in class. I was a little bit concerned earlier on in the day that we weren't going to be ready, but the later classes really stepped it up. I think maybe some of the earlier classes are still a little bit tired in the morning, not quite thinking straight. But as we got into the later parts of the day, students seemed to be much more in tune with what was going on. So I'm going to call it just a little bit of tiredness, maybe a little bit of shock, a little bit getting ready for this quiz. But irrigation is diverting water from a natural body like a river or sometimes a lake to a crop field. And the purpose of this is to be able to irrigate or water the soil and then therefore the plants. There were also a lot of questions about monarchy, and I understand why. Monarchy wasn't really a term we talked about in the notes, but we did mention people like King Narmer, King Hammurabi, right? So I thought it was necessary to explain. When you say king or queen, you're talking about monarchy, which is ruled by a single person, such as a king or a queen, right? So ruled by a single person. In most cases, it's a king or a queen. And oftentimes throughout history, when you refer to monarchy, you're talking about also having the concept of something called divine right. What this means is that the monarch is seen as a representative of God or the heavenly gods, okay? So when we see the pharaoh being a living god or the priest being in charge of Sumerian government early on, this is an example of monarchy with the establishment of divine right, this idea that God has granted the monarch or ruler permission to rule. On the other side of this, polytheism is a religious term that refers to the belief or the worship of multiple or many gods. Most of the early civilizations that we're learning about, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, ancient China, if we were to talk about ancient India, most of those religious practitioners were polytheistic. Judaism is one of the first monotheistic faiths. If you did your AMSCO reading, you would have learned that there's also another monotheistic faith that was around during this time, which was called Zoroastrianism, which was the belief in this one god named Ahura Mazda. Okay, so there are some monotheistic practitioners going around in the BC era, mostly Judaism, somewhat Zoroastrianism, but the vast majority of people are polytheistic during the BC era. Silt, extremely important to the overall understanding of this chapter, because almost every civilization mentioned in this chapter was based off of a river, right? These are called the river valley civilizations. So silt is an extremely fertile soil, which was left behind after the flood of a river. Tigris and Euphrates, Nile River. If we were to study China, we could talk about the Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Chang'an. If we were to study in India, we would have learned about the Indus River Valley, okay, the Ganges River as well. So rivers were very important to the success of these early civilizations. Next, let's take a look at the word pyramid. Don't get too bogged down on pyramids are just the resting place for pharaohs. They're really just tombs. Now they are elaborate structures, so the fact that they were able to be constructed by the Egyptians tells us that the Egyptians were extremely powerful. They were extremely wealthy. They also had slaves, and they did a lot of slave labor, or they utilized a lot of slave labor to build the pyramids. So those are some of the things that you want to know about pyramids. Next up is the term pharaoh. I'm going to keep it really simple. Pharaoh's an Egyptian god king. They're a living god. People believe that they had just as many or very close to as many powers as the heavenly gods. And this is also why we call Egypt a theocracy, right? Which is, we're going to talk about that here in a few moments. Actually, it's up right next. Here it comes. Theocracy is where there is religious rule. All right. It's a form of government that is based on religious authority. Now, I want to pause for stage identification here real quick and just remind you that both Egypt and Sumer practiced a theocracy at some point in time. When we remember learning about Sumer, we said the earliest rulers were the temple priests, right? And then they were eventually replaced by warriors during times of war. But if your temple priest is in charge of your government, that's a theocracy. In Egypt, the pharaoh, who's a god king, is in charge of government, is in charge of religion, is in charge of the military. That is also an example of theocracy. Okay, next we're talking Egypt here, mummification. This is the process of embalming and drying of a corpse to prevent decay. This is because the Egyptians believed in the afterlife, and they believed that their pharaohs would rule into the afterlife. So they would need to have their bodies preserved to be effective at doing that. And so that's why they practiced mummification. But mummification brought about a great knowledge of medicine for the Egyptian peoples. And that's why, if you look at your list on the review sheet, it tells you about some of the great Egyptian inventions. They are some of the first medical practitioners, some of the first surgeons. They understood the body because part of the mummification process meant the removal of the inner organs. And so as they're doing those removals, they are learning about the human anatomy. Next is papyrus. Papyrus is a plant. It grows heavily in the Nile Delta region. Now, we learned about what a delta was in section 2 toward the beginning, but it's a paper-like substance because the large leaves of the plant can be dried out, flattened, and used as a paper-like substance to write hieroglyphics on. So some of our ancient scrolls coming from Egypt were in the form of papyrus. We just mentioned hieroglyphics, so I thought that I would talk about that. Hieroglyphics, that's an ancient Egyptian writing system that basically used symbols and pictures that would stand for words and sounds and so on and so forth. It's very similar to cuneiform in the idea that it uses mostly pictures and symbols to stand for different things. Okay. There were a lot of questions today about these different kingdoms of Egypt, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom. So I kind of wanted to make that very clear tonight. I want to talk about what I think is really, really important to know about these three different kingdoms. First off, the Old Kingdom. I probably won't quiz you on the dates, but it's important to kind of know how these things fall in chronological order. So the Old Kingdom would be, as it states, 2660 to 2180 BC. Now, this is the time period, this is most important about it. This is the time period in which Egypt was very strong. And because they were very powerful, they were able to construct the Great Pyramids. This proves that the Egyptians were extremely powerful because let's think about it. Would they be able to have the time, the money, the effort, the government organization to make these large pyramid structures? Not unless they're extremely strong. This is like stunting. They're stunting on you. They're flexing on you. They're showing you that they're strong enough to build these monumental structures. Okay. That shows you that they are very powerful and a fantastic civilization. So that's what's going on during the Old Kingdom. It's probably the most influential time period in Egyptian history. After the Old Kingdom, though, they kind of go into a state of decline where there was some weak leadership. And after that period of weak leadership, the Middle Kingdom is marked by when strong rulers and pharaohs restored law and order. And this happened between 2040 all the way down to 1640 BC. So that's what you really want to know about the Middle Kingdom. That's really all you would need to know as far as being pertinent for this quiz tomorrow. All right, next let's go talking about the New Kingdom. So after the Middle Kingdom basically ends with an invasion from an outside force. The outside invaders were called the Hyksos. The Hyksos. They came in on war chariots, which was a development that the Egyptians did not have yet. So they were able to move about the battlefield in an expedited fashion. They moved quick and they struck, and they were able to put 2 or 3 archers and spear throwers into a chariot, which is pulled by the horse, 1 or 2, possibly 3 horse. So the Egyptians just couldn't keep up with them on the battlefield because of this major development, and they conquered Egypt. The Hyksos did. They conquered Egypt during the 1600s BC. The New Kingdom begins when the Egyptians drive the Hyksos out and then thus take over again, restoring what we say law and order in the Egyptian fashion. Okay, there is one key figure that I thought was pertinent to go over tonight to make sure that you are ready, and that's Gilgamesh. All right. Gilgamesh is talked about in the reading only. I didn't talk about Gilgamesh in the notes. This is one of those things I wanted to see if you could pick up from the reading. But there's a book, a story, an ancient myth called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh is basically in this book the name of a Sumerian warrior. We're not sure if he was a real warrior or if it's a fictional character, most likely a fictional character, but it kind of documents his life. And what we do from reading that book is we gather a lot of our understanding of Sumerian history from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay. Next, I want to talk briefly about the short answer possibilities. I wrote an essay possibility, which I said won't be an essay, but will primarily be an extended response, which is comparing and contrasting Egypt and Sumer, the 2 big civilizations that we've learned about. So for doing that successfully, what you would really need to do is focus on their governing styles, their setup. Like Egypt, we know was unified into a kingdom, right? We had Upper and Lower Egypt, then King Narmer unifies them. But Sumer was divided up into independent city-states, right? So that's a really big picture difference right there. One of the other things that I would say about the short answer is that I would really focus in on the role of women, how women were treated and their status in society of both Egypt and also Sumer, right? So I want to make sure that you're understanding that that is going to be an important, that may be its own short answer question. Okay, little hint there for you. And then finally, I would really focus on all the key figures. I've got one short answer that's going to involve those key figures. So I would say, to give you some advice, I would focus on what did the key figures accomplish? Okay. Why are they important to the chapter? And also, what civilization did they represent? Right? Were they from Babylon? Were they from Sumer? Were they from Egypt? Right? Were they from another entity that was mentioned in the chapter? So those are going to be some of the key things that you're going to want to know for the short answer. Okay, next, I do want to spend some time before we go into question and answer session regarding some AP tips and suggestions. And right now, all we are into is the introduction and the prologue. So your questions tomorrow on the AP portion, there's only going to be 5 questions. They're all going to be short answer, but they're going to be pretty detailed and they're going to have layers to them. The questions are going to have layers to them. So I would suggest a couple of things. Number 1, focus on those page numbers and those terms that I listed on the review sheet. That's going to be, I think, the best clue and help for you to focus in from all of those pages what you really need to clue into. I think that that's going to be your best frame of study. However, for all of you who are joining, there's 101 right now, according to my data. I am going to take you now to what I think are the most important 3 pages of that reading. So this won't cover you on all 5. It's not going to cover you on every part of the answer, but I'm going to throw this to you here and give it out to you. So I'm going to share real quick. And what we're going to do is we're going to grab some screenshots that I took from the textbook today. Okay. So The first one, and I probably understand that if you're watching this on your phone, this may be a little bit difficult to see. But the first one is going to talk about the overview of the exam. And what I mean by that is like, what type of questions do you have to answer on the exam? There are four types of questions. There are the multiple choice questions. That's part A. Those are commonly known as MCQs. There are 55 of those, and you only get 55 minutes to do those. The second part is what's called the short answer questions, or the SAQs. You have three of those. Two are mandatory, and then of question 3 and 4, you get to choose one. Okay. Then you get into your two essays. There's one called the document based question, or the DBQ. And then there's one called the long essay question, or the LEQ. On the DBQ, you do not get to pick your question. They give you the question, you must answer it. On the LEQ, you can select from question 2, 3, or 4. Okay. Notice that for these essays, you only get 40 minutes for the long essay question, and you get 60 minutes for the document based question. The document based question is most likely the hardest part of the exam because it's going to give you 7 separate primary source documents. You have to read those documents, then come up with a thesis argument, and then write your essay. So it's very much involved, and you only get 60 minutes, which is including a 15-minute, what they call reading period, to read those documents. Okay. So what I would like you to do is make sure that you not only understand the types of questions you're going to see, which would be very easy to answer if you study this page. But you also need to, from the reading, from the other pages, you need to be able to explain how these questions are laid out. Okay, so you need to make sure that you've read about these different question types and can basically answer and explain how they work. Next is going to be this page here that talks about the historical reasoning processes. The historical reasoning processes. The first one is comparison. In this class and on the AP exam, you have to be able to compare different civilizations, different styles of ruling, so on and so forth. You got to be able to understand number 2, causation. Okay. You want to be able to understand how this event or this action caused this one. Okay. So on and so forth. And then number 3, you need to be able to, on that exam, prove that you understand continuity and change over time. And what that means is continuity would be things staying the same, right? So how have things stayed similar over time, but then how have things changed over time? And you need to be able to explain those different ideologies in the AP world and on the AP exam. And then the third most important page is going to talk about the decline of the classical empires. When we talk about the classical empires, we're talking about those groups that we're learning about in this chapter. Okay. Sumerians, Egyptians. Eventually, when we get into the later chapters, chapter 5 and chapter 6, we'll talk about Rome and Greece. But there are 6 bullet points here that really give you a great idea of the usual suspects on why certain empires decline. So those are my biggest pieces of advice for you. Those are the biggest things I'd like to suggest. I'm going to come back to the regular view here. I kind of gave you more than I really wanted to on the AP tips and suggestions. That those are going to cover you on only part of 3 of the questions. The other 2 questions I'm going to keep in my pocket and have you work on your comprehension. So we will get a little bit of look from the introduction. All of the pages that I showed you were from the introduction part of the reading. The prologue part is a little bit more detailed. It talks about some civilizations. It talks about some faiths. It talks about some trade routes, right? So those are things that, having read the AMSCO, you're going to need to be able to answer questions on based on your comprehension and skill level there. Okay, I think at this time we can bump into the question and answer session. All right, so I'll go to the comments now. Give me just a moment. I see that there are 142 comments, so I'm going to try to take a look at those and make sure that I will answer any questions that came into play here. All right, I see a lot of folks are here. I appreciate that. Thank you for letting me know that you are in attendance. All right, and now I'm going to try to get to some of those questions. I'm taking a look here through. Yes, Jack, there is a quiz tomorrow. I know you were absent today, but the review sheet is available on the grade book. So you should be able to grab that and hopefully give it your best shot. Let me know. All right, can I go over? All right, here we go. Here's a good question. Was the Old Kingdom weak? No, actually, the exact opposite, Ella. The Old Kingdom was very strong, probably the strongest in Egyptian history, to be honest with you. Okay, that's because they were able to build those pyramids. So that meant they had a lot of extra time on their hands. They had a lot of great government organization. They were able to trade or purchase the limestone and granite that was necessary to build the pyramids. So I would say that was probably their best time period in history. Hudson, can you go over the government, please? All right. Well, basically in Sumer, you have city states, right? So you have a form of monarchy, first led by the priests and then later led by military leaders. So you have a form of monarchy, okay, either way there. In Egypt, you have a form of monarchy as well because you've got the pharaoh who's a god king. So what they said would go. So both would be considered forms of strong monarchy. However, I think you also have to say that at certain times, Sumer was a theocracy where there was a king that was also a religious leader. And then in Egypt, it's a theocracy because the pharaoh is a religious and government and military leader as well. So monarchy slash theocracy would be the similar form of government in both. The difference is Egypt is an empire, a unified empire, versus Sumerians being divided up into independent city-states. All right, Jack says, I haven't been at school since Thursday. Do I need to take this tomorrow? Well, if you missed Friday, you missed section 2 only. So you have the ability to do the video lesson. This would be something that's probably email me, Jack, and we can work something out. I would really like you to stay on path because when you miss that quiz and then you miss a day, then you're backed up. But let's give me this. Give me your best shot tonight, and then if you don't feel comfortable tomorrow, just let me know, and I'll be willing to work with you. Okay. But I really would like everybody to be ready to do that. Oh, this is Gordon K. This is Commissioner Gordon from last year, Sign of Strength. Thank you for the shout out there, Gordon. All right, let's see. Here we go. We got BMK. Was the Old Kingdom weak, or was there a time period in between the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom where there was a weak government? Yes, you are correct. So the Old Kingdom was strong. After the Old Kingdom ends, when the Old Kingdom ends, it ends with like weak leaders coming into play. So the end of the Old Kingdom is kind of when weak leaders sort of come in. And so that leads us into a time period of weak rule, which was then shuffled out with the advancement of the Middle Kingdom, where strong pharaohs came back into play. A lot of people have asked me today, how does it happen that all of a sudden we just have weak rulers? You got to think about this. Like, let's say that a king dies at an early age and his son is 4, 5, 10, 14 even. They're going to become the pharaoh right away. Can they really make effective decisions? No. So you're probably going to have other people like maybe a brother or a cousin kind of helping guide or make decisions until the young person is of age. But here's where weakness comes in. That young person, once they become king, they haven't really been guided by a true leader, a true pharaoh. And so they may make some rash decisions. And then if they don't know how to lead, their son is going to be the next pharaoh. he won't be able to know how to lead, right? So sometimes it takes good leadership and it takes good parenting that are leaders to pass that down. And if you don't have that, that can cause time periods of weak rule. All right. Is there a specific type of hand soap you recommend? I'm a big fan of Bath and Body Works. They make hand sanitizer that has like a cologne smell to it. That's kind of cool. So if you go to Bath and Body Works, they have different styles that are just for men, and those are the ones that I would say it's not really a soap. They do have soap with the same sense, but they've got hand sanitizer that I think is kind of cool. G Phillips, yeah. All right, okay, Gia. For the AP AMSCO assessment bar, do I need to be specific for the answers or is general idea okay? Well, it's a great question. I would say for some of the answers, I think broad answers will be okay. But for others, you're going to have to be fairly specific. I'd say on the introduction part, the questions that I went over the pages, broader will work. But for the prologue, when it's talking about different civilizations, different faiths, different trade routes, you're going to want to probably be a little bit more detailed there. Clara, what were the Egyptian inventions? Great question. Okay, there are quite a few you could mention. Let me go through a list with you here. I would say ones to focus on would be a calendar system, pyramids, mummification, papyrus, hieroglyphics, and then however you want to frame this, but I would say that I would really argue that medicine was one of their big inventions or developments as well. So those are the things that I would say you should focus on with Egypt. Okay, Nina, do you want us to know certain parts of Hammurabi's code, or do you want us to know the general? On Hammurabi's code, I'm not going to be asking you about specific laws. There were 282 of them. There were more than that, actually, but your book says there were 282. I would focus on the general idea, this idea that it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and that it was really the world's first documented code of laws to hold people accountable for their actions. That's really what you want to focus on with, of course, Hammurabi's code. Hammurabi also being from Babylon. We know that Babylon was a major city. It's located in modern day Iraq. So it had a high population. So rules and laws for the Babylonians were extremely important. They were the essence of keeping order in a large civilization in a large city like Babylon. Do we need to know all the key places? Yes, you should know all the key places. I'm not going to go over the key places, but you need to know, why Babylon was important. You need to know the different names of the rivers. You need to know the different flood patterns of those rivers. Were they regular? Were they irregular? You want to know everything you can about the Fertile Crescent, why it's called the Fertile Crescent, where it was located. You want to know everything that you can about Sumer, Egypt. We could spend the whole night talking about those key places. There's a lot to know: government, how they treated women, geographic features, right? Environmental challenges that we talked about in the notes. So yeah, I think the key places, they're hard to define because there's a lot. But yeah, you want to know as much as you can about the key places. They will show up often on the quiz tomorrow. Yes. Sign of strength, Brooklyn. Thank you. We still miss you. We still love you. We hope you come back. But thanks for joining. Appreciate you. Okay. Do we need to know dates? Howcroft, I would say you want to be able to put things into historical perspective, chronological order. So if there's a date mentioned in the book or a date mentioned in the notes, you should probably focus on that and be able to say, all right, yeah, the old kingdom happened before the middle kingdom, and the middle kingdom happened before the new kingdom, right? So I think that you want to know dates only to put things into chronological order. All right. Women's roles for Egypt. Women had many of the same rights as did men. For example, they could hold a job, they could hold property in their own name, they could actually initiate a marriage or a divorce. So they were kind of on equal footing with men in most situations in Egypt and in Sumer, to be honest with you. Um, I think what you mean here is roles for Egypt and also Mesopotamia. So very similar. And religion, I'm not sure if you mean women's role in religion. I know that in Sumer, women could be part of the priesthood. Not so much the same in Egypt, but women were oftentimes rulers in Egypt. We have several rulers that were pharaohs that were women, Nefertiti, one named Hatshepsut, and then eventually later, much later on, Cleopatra. But female leadership in Egypt was common. Okay. Key figures, Miriam says. I talked about Gilgamesh. Talked about Gilgamesh being that Sumerian warrior and the book being written about that character. We're not exactly sure if Gilgamesh was a real person or a fictional character, but I would know it nonetheless. I would also say Sargon of Akkad forms the world's first empire by invading the city-states of Mesopotamia. He conquers both the northern part and the southern part. I would also say for King Narmer, right? Narmer is the king responsible for, in basic terms, uniting the kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt into one unified kingdom. And then also, I would also argue for the last one, Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a Babylonian king that basically wrote Hammurabi's code to keep law and order. So those are some of the most basic things that I would focus in on there, Miriam. That's a good question, but there's 4 key figures there. You're going to want to know those in and out. There's going to be several different questions about them. And then key figures also from the AMSCO would be something that any key figure mentioned in the AMSCO reading would also be important. King Tut doesn't really come into play until like 1300 BC, somewhere in that range. So a little bit out of our scope for this chapter, BMK. Yeah, he's a young king, but I don't think that his influence really affects this quiz. Okay, a little bit later. Babylon and Sumer. Well, Babylon is a key city-state. It became the capital of the Babylonian Empire. Sumer, as you know, is part of the Fertile Crescent. It's really small, though. It's kind of the size of like really an East Coast state like Massachusetts, something like that. So it's a smaller entity within the Fertile Crescent, but it's home to the first civilization, Sumer. Do we need to know when yeah, in Egypt, you want to know that it floods in July and recedes in October. That couldn't hurt. And then you also want to know that the Nile River, that's the Nile River, is more regular than the Tigris and Euphrates. We don't know exactly what time of the year the Tigris and Euphrates would flood. Dates and locations of the religions from the AMSCO portion. Definitely locations. Definitely, I would say locations, how they spread, right? The time period is kind of all in the BC era, right? And somewhat in the early AD era. So the time period is kind of all mixed in there. So I would say that you don't want to get too bogged down in the dates, but more so the locations. Yes, I think that that's a really good point, Sarah. Hey, Master Nick, Master Gisha is actually one of my former ballers, a member of the realm himself. So he's giving you guys a nice shout out. That's awfully kind and generous. Thank you, Mr. Gisha. Appreciate you. Great teacher, great guy. Billy, hopefully this is not the shampoo Billy. I don't think so, but Billy Hardenberg says, can you go over the roles of women in Egypt? Yeah. Women in Egypt had many of the same rights as did men. They could hold leadership positions, which is a sign of that significant status. They could propose, initiate marriage. They could initiate divorce, right? They had rights in divorce. They actually got property out of divorce. So these are some of the things that you might want to consider when you're thinking about women's role in Egypt. Overview and scoring. Do we need to know the numbers and statistics of the questions? I think the question type is the most important factor there. The question type, I think, is what I would really focus in on. Okay, Chloe, Babylon is both a city that was the capital of the Babylonian Empire, and then the Babylonian Empire was one of those empires that ruled in Sumer. So you had the Sumerians, then you had a group called the Akkadians, led by Sargon of Akkad. Then after that, the Babylonians conquered the Akkadians, and then they took over, establishing an empire with their capital city at Babylon along the Euphrates River. Okay, Gianna says, what are some of the Sumerian inventions aside from cuneiform? All right, excellent. So Sumerian inventions include the wheel, the sail, the plow, the metal known as bronze, which is a mixture of copper and tin, cuneiform writing, of course. Those are some of the big ones that you want to know. Wheel, sail, plow, bronze, cuneiform. Those are some, I think that would cover you right there. Wally, if you were paying attention, I just answered that one. The same question was right above yours. Did the Tigris and Euphrates rivers both flood? Yes, they did both flood. So they both gave you that benefit. Not much, Flo. I'd say there's more similarities there. I think that one you're focused on very similar ideologies. I would say the one difference is you don't see as many female priests in Egyptian history as you do in Sumerian history. That would be the one contrast. So I would say there's more similarities than there are differences. The 3 pages that I gave you, do those go over 3 questions? If they do, then are the other ones about the terms you gave, the ones under the pages? Those 3 pages could be absorbed into 1 or 2 questions, could be 3 questions. Most likely you're going to get 3 separate questions, 1 from each of those pages. Then the other 2 would come from the rest of the reading. Yes, mostly, as I said, the prologue. All right, those are all the questions up to this point. The last question was entered at 9:40. So I am just going to wait a little longer and see if any other questions pop in. We've been on for roughly 45 minutes, so kind of exactly what I promised. But I will stay on to answer any final questions that you have. While I'm waiting for those questions to come in, I'd like to give you my final piece of advice. My final piece of advice is, number 1, study your outlines. That's why we write the outlines. They're the most important transcripts to get ready for these quizzes. So make sure that you read those several times through tonight, maybe even one more time in the morning. Use your review sheet to quiz yourself, right? That's why I make you do it on a separate sheet so that you can use the blank review sheet to look at the terms and answer them in your head. You say, hey, do I know what a city-state is? If you can answer that one and you get it right, great. Check yourself on your answers. Make sure you have it right. Go ahead and mark off the ones that you did properly. Circle the ones that you don't know quite yet, and keep doing the quizzing of yourself until you can answer all of them from your understanding without looking at your notes. I think that would be the best possible way. What is important to know about the Tigris and Euphrates River? Well, They are the frame of Mesopotamia, number one, Chloe. Number two, for the Sumerians, their flood patterns were very irregular. So we didn't know exactly when they were going to flood. We knew they were going to flood at least once a year, but it wasn't very predictable. So you want to make sure that you are understanding that these rivers were important based on the flood and the silt and the crops. You want to make sure that you understand that they are the ultimate means of agriculture to the Sumerian people. That's probably the most important factor there. G. Phillips. I'm sorry. I think, did I say Bed Bath? I meant to say Bath and Body Works. I think I said Bath and Body Works. They got all the different smell good stuff, the different lotions. I don't know when they're open, man, but you know, I think you'd be okay until tomorrow or maybe the next day. Should be good. Mesopotamia, by terminology, is simply the land between the two rivers. So, as I was just talking with Chloe, it's the strip of land that's located in between the Tigris and Euphrates. That's Mesopotamia. Jerome says, what are some common neglected topics? If there are, can you briefly cover it? You know, I don't know if I can throw you a bone on this one. I'll say some of the AMSCO terms are not going to be on there. That would be the one thing I'd say might be neglected, but a lot of them are. So you should study all of them because you just don't know which ones are and which ones aren't, Jerome. The review sheet isn't altogether too long, so I would know it all and cover yourself in that fashion. Once again, if you haven't given me a shout out, if you haven't let me know that you're here, I'd really like to know so that I can see kind of who does well on the quiz. And I also just like to know who's in the session. It kind of helps me understand who's here. But I also would like to say, if you're enjoying this, please let me know if this is helpful. I hope that it is. And then hopefully tomorrow it'll pay dividends for you in the long run. Elena says, what's the difference between the geography of Mesopotamia and the geography of Egypt? Oh, well, that's a great question, actually, Elena. This is a sign of strength. Let me tell you, the geography of Mesopotamia is one that does not have a whole lot of natural barriers of defense, right? Geographic landscape there is southern, some desert. We've got the two rivers. We've got some distant mountains. Remember, we don't have a whole lot of natural barriers of defense in Mesopotamia, and we have a limited amount of natural resources. So they had to trade extensively. Egypt is in kind of a similar situation. They do have a little bit more mountains in what we call Upper Egypt, right? But Lower Egypt, not so much. And then they are kind of completely surrounded by desert. So that's a natural barrier for them, but it also kind of limits their propensity to trade in long distance situations, right? So when you have natural barriers, it defends you, but it also kind of prevents you from getting outward and trading as well. So those are some of the basic differences in geography between those two entities. I am going to grade the AMSCO quizzes tomorrow. So that's all me up until the end of the year AP exam. That's the only one that's separate. So until we get to that point, I will be grading those. That's a good question, Lucas. I haven't really charted that out. I have the record on my live replay. So I just went over the quiz today. So I'm going to get to that. It's just, I'm not going to do it just yet. So I'll probably have to kind of play a little bit of catch up on that aspect there. But I will get to it. I'm just looking for more questions. Howcroft says, Can you go over Upper and Lower Egypt? Yes. Upper Egypt is located in the south. It's just called Upper Egypt because it has more mountainous terrain. It's more highly elevated. Lower Egypt was actually located in the north. It has a lower elevation. That's why it's called Lower Egypt. What you want to know is that they were two separate kingdoms until Narmer unifies them around 3100 BC. Last year, geography was only one semester, so this year it's the whole year. I don't think so. I think it's still a semester. I think the young men trade off. The girls, unfortunately, don't have geography, but in this class, we will continue to talk about geography throughout the year. Yes. All right. I don't see any other questions, so I think I'm going to call it a wrap for tonight. It's been 51 minutes. I certainly appreciate all of you joining, and I hope that you can benefit from this greatly. And I hope that you will perform to the best of your ability tomorrow. I think that you can only do the best that you can. So the amount of stress that you put on yourself should be alleviated by understanding that if you study, if you prepare to the best of your ability, and you give it your best effort, you're a champion in my book. All right. God bless all of you tonight. Hey, make sure you say thank you to your parents. I want to say thank you to you and to your parents, but make sure that you're doing that for me. That's one favor that I would ask. Get some rest, get your final preparations and studies in, and let's show up tomorrow ready to rock and roll. Okay. Let's ball out of control and rep the realm. Take it easy, boys and girls. We'll see you tomorrow.